Welcome, everyone, to this webinar of the Institute of Current World Affairs. I'm Gregory Pfeiffer, the Executive Director. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of a topic that I feel has fallen off the radar a little bit, at least for many, since the early days of the pandemic. The fact is that COVID-19 is affecting human mobility in unprecedented ways. Millions of migrant workers have been stranded. Many of them have lost their livelihoods. And international migrants make up roughly 3.5% of the global population and contribute around 10% of global GDP. So whether it's developing economies that depend on remittances from abroad or industries that depend on migrant labor, the pandemic will have long-term effects for everybody, in addition to human development and, of course, the global economy beyond the immediate crisis that migrants and their families face. So joining us to discuss these and other issues is Amelia Frank-Vitale. She is a New York-based cultural anthropologist who focuses on Central American migration and violence. Her ICWA fellowship in 2012 to 2014, if I've got that right, was in Mexico, where she studied migration through the country. And Malia Politzer is an investigative journalist based in Spain who covers immigration, refugees, and international development. She's written for Foreign Policy magazine, the New York Times, and other outlets. And her ICWA fellowship in 2013 to 2015 was in India and Spain, where she studied Europe's refugee crisis, identity issues, and religious tensions. And moderating is Dilday, a journalist who is also based in New York. She has lived and worked in North Africa and Europe and held staff positions at the New York Times, and most recently was a senior editor at Atlantic Media. She was an ICWA fellow based in France and Morocco in 2005 to 2007. Thank you all for taking part so much. So our panelists will talk for about 30 minutes, followed by another 30 minutes of questions that I will jump back in to moderate. So to ask a question, please click on the hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom box to virtually raise your hand. We'll see your questions and pick you chronologically, and you'll be muted until I call on you to speak. Please introduce yourself and ask a single brief question. And Rebecca Picard of the Institute of Current World Affairs is also on the line and will help respond and get us through any possible technological hangups. So thank you, and Kay, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Gregory. So I'm so happy to be here, especially with these two panelists who I've never had the chance to meet in person, but I've read a lot of your really interesting research. And when I was doing my fellowship in France and Morocco, of course, most of the migrants there were from North Africa. But I think that today, because of the panel, we're going to mostly have a Southern focus in that, which is actually most migration is kind of south to south. That's one thing that I've learned in doing research about this. So Amelia, you are focused on, you've been working in Mexico and with Honduran immigrants or migrants. It's been part of the caravan, I know. And what's been really interesting now is that we have some stats is that as many as, let's see, and I want to make sure I'm going to get this right. So the United States has sent over 20,000 migrants back, mostly to Mexico, and many of whom are Honduran. And the Mexican government has handled that by letting many of them go, which I guess is not an optimal situation because they are actually stranded in Mexico. And I think that this also will relate to what Malia, you will be speaking about, because Spain has done a much better job of handling. It has also let migrants go or release them, but it has been in a much better way that has proven to be a more effective way for improving their quality of life. So why don't we start with you, Malia, to talk a little bit about the bad side of it, so to speak.
With me?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Amelia.
The names sound so similar.
They really do. Yeah, so I actually the New York Times and the Marshall Project just put together, just released a video story that talks about how ICE is exporting COVID-19 through deportation. So I think the numbers actually doubled since that statistic was released, 20,000. It's actually been 40,000 people since March the United States have deported. And most of them are to Central America. That's the highest that they've received. I think it's 60% of the deportees have gone to Central America. So the United States is deporting people to Mexico for sure, but it's also deporting people to Central America directly, to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras particularly are the three countries that make up the bulk of that. And yeah, it is a humanitarian crisis, it is a human rights crisis, it's a public health crisis. So Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have each closed their borders. They closed their borders really early on. El Salvador in particular really locked down very, very quickly in order to prevent COVID-19 from actually even taking hold in the country. There hadn't been any confirmed cases when El Salvador closed its borders. But the United States has been deporting people that we have in detention here back to these countries and really kind of strong-arming Central American countries and other countries around the world. This is not unique to Central America, but that's the place that I know best. Has been really strong-armed these countries into receiving deportees who have been held in crowded detention centers in the United States, in some cases for a very long period of time. In many cases, people are moved around from detention center to detention center within the United States, and that causes, of course, the spread of COVID-19 as well, and then are deporting them back to Central America. So Guatemala, for a little while, tried to stop receiving flights because so many people were coming back who then tested positive for the disease. But the United States threatened to withhold aid to any countries that stopped receiving deportees, and also threatened the visa statuses of people who had legal visas to travel to the United States. So Guatemala relented. El Salvador and Honduras never tried to stop. They have a different relationship with the United States in general. But each of these countries now receiving, we don't know exactly how many because ICE isn't testing everybody, and the public health infrastructure in Central America is quite lacking. So we don't know exactly how many, but hundreds of people are being sent back who got COVID-19 in detention centers in the United States and are now being deported back to countries that maybe wouldn't have had, at least not to this degree, such a spread of the disease if they weren't being forced to receive deportees. So what's happening in Mexico is a little bit of a different story. There's also people who are trying to apply for asylum who are no longer even allowed to start a case in the United States, and they are being required to just wait in Mexico. And those conditions are also terrible. People are living in basically tent cities along the US-Mexico border. And some of this started long before the pandemic did, in early 2019, kind of as a response to the caravan in 2018. The Trump administration started something that they ironically call the Migrant Protection Protocols, which sent asylum seekers back to Mexico to wait for court dates in the United States. So that was already going on. There were already tens of thousands. I think the number was up to 60,000 people who were in that program waiting in Mexico. And that's been exacerbated by I think it was the CDC in March said that they wouldn't accept any new asylum cases, any new asylum applications because of a public health crisis. And the DOJ just kind of doubled down on that this past week, stating that basically asylum cases couldn't be heard if the person was coming from a country that had substantial spread of the disease, which of course is everywhere in Latin America now. That's a brief overview of the bad.
And so let me ask you, I've also read that, but for migrants who are actually here in detention centers in the United States, actually when I say here, I mean the United States, some of them are being released. There has been a slight loosening of restrictions. And can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there's a loosening of restrictions. What I would say is that some lawyers have been very successful at arguing that particular people need to be released from detention for health concerns. And that is a long-standing, that is one way that people have been able to be released from detention in the past. So some people have been released from detention now because they are able to convince the judge in their area that for public health reasons they are unsafe inside the detention center. But I actually think that that reflects another major problem with the way that detention and asylum works in the United States, because only if you have access to a lawyer or are extremely lucky are you able to make those kinds of claims in front of anybody who has any power to do anything about it. And most people who are detained do not have legal representation. They're not entitled to legal representation on a pro bono basis, or they're not entitled to a state-sponsored legal representation. And so most people who are detained do not have the legal knowledge, resources, or capacity to even argue in front of anybody that could make this decision that they should be released. So most people are not going to be released.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Amelia. That is a good, it seems like, well, a good assessment of a bad situation. So please pronounce your name for me again, Malia.
Malia.
Malia. Okay. I did.
Yeah, you had it right. You have it right. Yeah.
I do have it right. So now what I have been reading is that Spain has taken a very different approach. And it might be that we're hearing about a rosy picture there of a sort of a new day in the middle of a bad situation for migrants. Can you just sort of give us an assessment of what's been happening and how that has been, and whether it is in fact as positive as some of the news reports have been?
So I would say yes and no. I would say that some of the different issues that Amelia just outlined in terms of people being at risk in detention facilities, they've handled that aspect really well, because when Spain went into lockdown in on March 14th, one of the first things that the government did was announce that they were going to basically release everyone who is in the detention facilities who were going to be slated for deportation. And from what I understand, and the people I spoke to about that, that was actually handled quite smoothly. So basically they gave that order, and within days, I mean, each detention facility was kind of monitored by a judge who oversaw like how they did that. And the first thing that happened in most of them, so it happened differently in each place, but the judge essentially, like the one that I spoke to, in Algeciras, for example, which was one of the biggest ones. First, they released the people who already had families or friends or residencies in Spain, and then they had kind of liaison with local NGOs or kind of some of the Catholic charities that either opened up, like they were either the same way that they dealt with the homeless in Madrid, where they had large centers with supposedly social distancing. I haven't heard of any audits of these places, so I don't know what actually was like inside of those places, where they had beds at certain intervals, or in some of the other cases, they even had hotels that were opened and that were paid for by these different groups, and that migrants had a place to stay or at that time. So those are the people who are already in the detention facilities. And in Spain, the detention facilities are basically for deportation, but they are quite controversial here as well, because there's just a lot of issues with them in general, in terms of them not having great, in general, like not being there for a long time, a lot of delays before the deportation happens, and just overall sanitation is not really good. So I think that decision was good, and that they were taken care of also was good. There's a different situation with the people who are already in the asylum system, and that I think has been less rosy, and that is linked. So basically, Spain's in kind of a unique situation. You need to know some background on the asylum system right now here in Spain. The past year, Spain has really become one of the top receiving countries of asylum applications in all of Europe. And between 2018 and 19, the asylum load doubled in Spain and totally overwhelmed the system. They were not prepared. They did not, and they're not processing them nearly fast enough. So last year, there were 18,000 applications, and I think they only managed to process about 50% of them. So now the rest of them are here. And the problem with that is all of those pending applications. So basically for the first 6 months, first of all, you have to get the meeting. And then once you have that meeting, for the first 6 months, you can't work. So you're automatically working, under the table. And then even once you get certification to work, the problem is if you're a professional, you have to have your previous work certifications kind of accredited, which is a process that can take years. So right now, the vast majority of asylum seekers here in Spain are actually, it's interesting, it's different than it has been for the rest of Europe, because about 80 to 90%, I think, are actually from Latin America, mostly from Venezuela. And so they changed the asylum system to try to expedite this. They've actually granted Venezuelans this kind of temporary humanitarian residency permit to allow them to work. But basically the result of this is, under the lockdown, you had a huge number of people who have asylum applications either in process or who had work permits, but a lot of people, since they didn't have their ability to get really good jobs in the formal sector, a lot of them were in service sector jobs, and so you had a lot of people who suddenly were cut off from any kind of ability to work, which is true for a lot of people. But in Spain, they've been really good at giving aid. Basically, you have formal work permits here in Spain, or if you have formal employment here, they were supporting basically 70% of your salary. The government would give 70% of your salary to people. So a lot of people, like normal Spaniards who are in the formal economy, were supported by this, but a lot of the people who are asylum seekers are often working as house cleaners or working in places where they really, basically just, they suddenly don't have work. So a lot of the jobs for the Venezuelans are housekeepers, regardless of if they're doctors. I mean, there are cases of doctors and nurses who said, we want to be a part of this, and we know you have a short staff, you're short-staffed at the hospitals. Like, this is what we're trained to do. I remember reading an article about somebody who was exactly like the type, I'm not a doctor, but they worked with respiratory disorders in Venezuela, and they wanted to be a part of being able to help, but they were just cut out because they didn't get the permits to be able to work. So in that aspect, I think people really have been impacted. It's been really tremendously difficult because a lot of people haven't gotten any aid from the government. And so at a time when it's one of the strictest lockdowns in Europe, where you can get fined hundreds of dollars just for being out for the wrong reason, it's that aspect of it, I think, has been really, really difficult for people.
So that's really interesting, Malia. So that has been one thing that keeps coming up in the discussion about how this has affected migrant workers and everyone else, because of course there are many people out of work, but not having access to some of the supports that some of the countries have put in. And even in Spain, even if they are released to some of their family members, or they are released because they have family members, it sort of is it creating a burden on entire families. And so how has Spain put anything in place to provide supports for these undocumented migrants, or maybe they are, as you said, slightly documented, but they don't have work permits? Have they created any sort of system, as well as, I'm not sure about their access to the healthcare system in Spain. I know that it's very different from country to country about whether you have to have some sort of documentation to access the healthcare system. But with those two things, how has that been affecting migrants in Spain?
So they do have access to healthcare. So that aspect is quite good here in Spain. So it's very complicated. So basically, if people do have refugee status, asylum, and they have formal work permits, not formal work permits, they have a contract. They have a contract where they had a certain salary, and that's in the tax system. They would have access to the 700, not necessarily 700, but they'd have access to, essentially, it's called paro. It's basically the Spanish version of unemployment, where they have a certain number of support. If they're have informal work, however, they won't necessarily have access to that. And the other problem too is I believe, and it's pretty nuanced, but I believe they have to be here for a year before they, be here legally for a year before they have access to that as well. People who are undocumented don't have any sort of aid whatsoever. Interestingly enough, the people who are working in agriculture, like for example, in invernaderos, what's it called? The greenhouses in Almeria. There's a huge migrant population. They're primarily undocumented working there. They weren't as impacted because they were considered essential workers. Their work continued, and there actually weren't any outbreaks there, even though where they actually lived were really terrible conditions. that's, you know, the same year round, regardless of COVID-19. It's just that's an ongoing issue in Spain. But because they continue to have access to employment, they continue to have access to their salaries, they weren't as impacted as the people who live in cities, for example. But one of the issues, so one of the things that Spain's recently put into place is, well, they're saying it's universal basic income. It's not actually universal basic income. It's kind of a top up. So they look at the most vulnerable families and they guarantee a certain amount based on if you're a single person, like per month. I think it's around a little under 400 euro, although, which is not a lot, but kind of the average minimum salary here in Spain is around 700 euros. So it helps. And then if you're a family, I think you can get up to 1,000 something. So now technically migrants are, if you have legal status in Spain, eligible for that after a year of being here. But again, I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many bureaucratic loopholes here. So I haven't been able to ascertain if they say, you know, you're here legally for a year, does that qualify? For example, do the Venezuelans who have these renewable one-year permits, would they qualify for that if they just renewed for a year? Or since it's a yearly annual permit, does it start from scratch each year? I'm just not sure. I mean, there's just a lot of questions. And then one of the other issues that's happened now is I think this has happened in some other countries too, like basically when they had the state of alarm, they stopped, basically immigration services all shut down. Mm-hmm. So there were no one was accepting any new claims. That meant people who had recently come here, and a lot of people had recently come from various parts of Latin America, primarily Venezuela and some other places, they had no way of entering the system. Mm-hmm. So now not only is there a huge backlog, so they're processing them much sooner, but these people are basically totally shut out of the system because right now, I mean, this is something that I just read the other day, and I had personal experience with this as well. No one's able to get appointments, and there even seems to be kind of I don't want to say a mafia, but people who are opportunistically like scooping up all of the appointments to go to the extranjería, the immigration system, to try to get it, and charging 180 euro, which for a service that should be free. You should just be able to get that. But people are getting all of those and then charging asylum seekers, migrants, and even, you know, people who have long-term residency visas just need to renew them to try to get those meetings. So it's quite a mess here in that respect. And who has access to services? Like, I think it's more disorganization than maliciousness, but the impact is the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So
let's go back on to that topic with you, Amelia, a bit. So your work, you focus mostly on a particular on Honduran immigrants, I think. So where, I think mostly in the United States and in Mexico, is that where you have been working? Oh, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I think you might be muted.
I'm better. Sorry. I actually focus mostly on what happened to people after they're deported back to Honduras. So I did research in Honduras, and then I did research in Mexico with people in transit. And I serve as an expert witness in Honduran asylum cases in the United States. So I have some familiarity with what happens here, but my research is actually mostly on what happens when people are either en route or once they're sent back.
So that's sort of, let's talk about that, about how what their access to health care, and also how they are able to gain any money. I mean, Mexico's economy is, there's so many people working in the informal economy who are legal residents of Mexico. And so there's probably even much less room for people who are migrating through or who stranded there to have access to that economy. But also with healthcare and access to healthcare, both in, along the way. And if you do even happen to get released in the United States, or even if you are in detention, what's that looking like? What you can tell?
It's really abysmal. I mean, really, it is a crisis of public health and human rights on every level. I'm actually going to start in Honduras because that is actually what I know the best. So Honduras was already in a pretty fragile situation. Honduras is a place that has very high rates of violence. It has very high rates of poverty and inequality. Access to healthcare was already stretched quite thin in Honduras, and this has just made fragile systems collapse. I mean, Honduras is really, really close to ceasing to function if it's not already gotten there for large sectors of the population. Just this last week, the doctors in San Pedro Sula, which is the second largest city in Honduras, but it's sort of the industrial hub and the economic hub of the country, said that they were going to shut down their hospitals if the maquilas, the sweatshops, didn't shut down. Because although Honduras initiated a lockdown pretty early on in the pandemic, all the foreign-owned sweatshops were given an exception and allowed to keep operating to make things like Fruit of the Loom and Gildan are both made in Honduras, and others as well. But so people who were quite exposed are still being made to congregate in poorly ventilated, very hot, very, very poor conditions in essentially concrete block rooms, working 10, 12, 17-hour shifts to produce cheap clothing. And so the government allowed those to keep operating even though the virus was spreading already in the country. I have a friend in Honduras, a young woman who she and her sister had been deported and she had never been deported before, who both got ill in May, and they tried to get tested. They were very, very ill, and they live in a pretty poor neighborhood in the center of San Pedro Sula that is very densely populated. And they went to the hospital, the public hospital, to try and get tested. They said there were no tests available that day, to come back the next day. They did that same routine for 3 days. They finally got tested, and it took more than 6 weeks for them to get results saying that they were positive. And in the meantime, they had been living in this extremely densely populated neighborhood, infecting who knows how many people. They were very ill. They both survived, but that is one tiny story of many, many, many stories like that in Honduras. So the health system there is unable to deal with the situation. And that is what we are deporting people back to, some of whom are carrying the disease with them, and some of whom are likely to get it upon return. In Mexico, technically, legally, whether or not you are a citizen, you have access to healthcare. So technically, a migrant who was to fall ill in Mexico should be able to get healthcare in a public hospital. But as is the case with many, many things in Mexico, what it says technically and what is actually happens in practice are two different things. And so migrants really have to kind of know their rights and be able to defend them for themselves if they want to try and get healthcare. And that was true before the pandemic, and it's just, everything is just exacerbated now. And then in the United States, people who are undocumented in the people who are citizens of the United States don't have access to healthcare very frequently. People who are undocumented are even more vulnerable, even less likely to seek out emergency care. I keep seeing new data that says that the immigrant population is one of the hardest hits in terms of deaths and illness related to COVID-19 in the United States. And as we know, healthcare isn't universally accessible to a lot of people here. And if you are an immigrant who is afraid of possibly being detained and deported, especially given the current climate where there is an obsession with deportation, the immigrant communities are being impacted in a way that I don't think we will fully understand the fallout of this for a long time.
Okay, so this is, I mean, it's a very dire situation for everyone, whether you are a wealthy documented person or an undocumented person. But so what are some of the ways that you think this will change migration? I know you said, Malia, that between 2018 and 19, applications in Spain doubled, and largely, I think, from Venezuelans. Do you anticipate, or are people with access to or knowledge of the systems, are they anticipating that migration will decrease? Are they anticipating that, that people will stay in place? That's one of the things that I've been reading is that not only when people are sort of kicked out of their jobs, when they're undocumented workers are kicked out of their jobs, they often don't have enough money to return home, or it's if they return back to their home country where they may have more supports, they often expect that they won't be able to be allowed back in. How do you see this in the fields you study changing migration in the coming years, in the coming 2 years, for example? And that's sort of like asking you to have a crystal ball. Do your best, please.
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I mean, so much of it depends on what and how people control the borders, right, in Europe. And that's kind of an open question mark right now. Like recently, they have opened up travel for within Europe. They've also opened up travel to certain approved countries outside of Europe. I honestly don't recall what Latin American countries might have been on that list. I suspect probably none of them, to be honest. I think mostly it was the EU. I saw like Morocco even. I mean, they would love to deport people back to Morocco. Morocco's borders are closed, so that's not happening right now. But it's definitely hasn't been the focus. In fact, so right now also Spain has really been grappling, like they've been having a very difficult time kind of forming a government over the past years. And so there's, this coalition government where they've been trying to kind of create a functional policymaking force. And so there has been Unidos Podemos, which is more of a far left party, has recently, actually, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, was pushing to talk about regularizing all of the undocumented and asylum seeker, or basically giving them status, like they've done in Portugal. In Portugal and in Italy, which is temporary status, just to give them access. But they're saying giving them more long-term status, and maybe even essential workers giving them citizenship, knowing that that's not realistic. But it just shows that the dialogue, like that the political dialogue here isn't quite as hard as it is in the US around these issues, that's even something that they can talk about and bring that up, knowing that it's not going to happen. At the same time, we do have a far right party here that has been kind of making the right further right. We have Vox, which for the first time got parliamentary seats. No one thought that was possible. So I think that it's really anyone's guess policy-wise what will happen here. It's really hard to say what'll happen into the future. I do think that with all of the asylum claims pending, I don't see it getting a lot better anytime soon, because it's clear that those cases are just piling up. I mean, there's already, like I said, half of the cases from last year. At the beginning of this year, there were, I think, 3,500 new asylum claims in Spain per week. That was even higher than Spain ever got at the height of the 2015 crisis. Obviously, that is now down to probably zero, or not zero, but very, very low, because there aren't any new flights coming in. But they have all of those new claims that they have to still address with the system that's basically collapsed at this time, where there's honestly migrants and asylum seekers just aren't the priority for the government.
There must be, with the economy, the economies are sort of in a downswing anyway. Like and is there a hardening of public opinion? I'm going to come back to you and ask about this as well, Amelia, but have you found a hardening of public opinion in regard to migrants?
I haven't seen that. Definitely Vox, which is again the far right party, has been trying to put that into play. And those that support Vox do agree with that. I mean, there is some push to be more, but I haven't seen it crystallized into a real public opinion hardening against. If anything, I would say that at least here in the South, although here in the South it tends to veer more left anyway, there was a lot more movement. And in fact, there's been a whole bunch of like in the wake of what happened with the police brutality with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, there have actually been a lot of sympathetic protests here, both about racism, but also about immigration, regularizing immigration. So, I mean, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say where the political opinion is lying right now. It's definitely not as divisive as it is in the United States. I'd say that there's still more sympathy for immigrants than there is not, but I would say that it's becoming more of a wedge issue than it has been in the past. So it's kind of a non-answer.
But that's all that you can really do right now.
Yeah.
So Amelia, you sort of touched on something that I was asking about by talking about how dire the situation is in Honduras now that it's collapsing. So there's so there might be a concept that, with the U.S. economy going into recession, with the Mexico economy, the peso has dropped tremendously, as we know, in the last couple of months, that it will be less appealing for migrants from some of the countries that you've worked with, particularly Honduras, to come to these places. But I'm gathering from what you're saying that it's still worth the risk. Is that true?
Yeah, I think since the pandemic started, I've lost count of the number of people who've reached out to me and been like, I'm thinking it's time for me to go. What's it like on the border? When you
say people who've reached out to you, do you mean from Honduras or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people from Honduras. Yeah, sorry. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, people who have either migrated before and been deported or are thinking about doing it for the first time. In Honduras, many people are more worried about dying of hunger than they're worried about dying from the coronavirus. Mm-hmm. The situation in Honduras is so complicated and so terrible. I feel like we could spend 7 hours just talking about that. So distilling it down quickly is a little bit challenging. But basically, the ruling party in Honduras, the government of Honduras, is illegitimate. He stayed in power in 2017 despite a constitutional prohibition to re-election. The election was widely understood to be a fraudulent election. And he claimed victory, even though really there is very little credibility to that victory. I was living in Honduras at the time, and even pretty moderate outlets like The Economist did a whole analysis of how the election was fraudulent. But he stayed in power, and he's really consolidated power in his person and a very close circle of people. At the same time, his brother was recently convicted, at the end of last year, was convicted in New York of being an international drug trafficker. And so he's in federal prison in the United States now, along with a bunch of other people from the ruling party in Honduras, including the former head of the national police and other allies of the current president. So the situation in Honduras is increasingly what people are calling a narco dictatorship. So the president in power is deeply, deeply linked to international drug trafficking organizations, but he is also very, very much supported by the Trump administration in the United States. And in Honduras, a government couldn't stay in power without the support from the U.S. Embassy. Mm-hmm. And at the U.S. Embassy, who is really making policy in Central America, is not the Department of State, but it is DHS. DHS, Homeland Security, is who is negotiating and figuring out the relationship between the United States and Honduras. And I understand a similar situation to be true in El Salvador and in Guatemala. And so basically, whatever happens in Honduras is fine, as long as Honduras is playing ball with the very, very draconian and inhumane immigration agenda of this administration. So, for example, I think just last week, a new caravan started out from San Pedro Sula. This is since the enormous one in 2018. There have been a couple of smaller ones that have started out in different periods through all of 2019. Mexico really cracked down on them, though, in southern Mexico, so they didn't make it to the northern border for the most part. But one started last week, and the Honduran government arrested everybody before they even left Honduras. So now there is no actual crime being committed. There is nothing. In fact, circulation is legal within Central America, so they should have even been able to go into Guatemala without any problem. But they were just walking in their own country, and they were arrested, enacting the immigration agenda of the Trump administration inside Honduras.
So I think what you're saying is that Honduran immigrants still want to migrate or migrate because of the situation there, but the government of Honduras is being enabled in its and some of its other more nefarious activities by, as long as they stick to this immigration agenda. So it's just as difficult now for them.
It's worse. I mean, people in Honduras live day to day. Many people sell on the street and they take that money and that's how they eat the next day, and they're not able to sell on the street, so they don't have anything to eat. So all of the reasons, and this, I'll close with this, all of the reasons that people were fleeing Honduras for the last 10 years are only going to be exacerbated by everything that has fallen apart due to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And still these places, these destinations are a more appealing destination than the one at home. Yes.
The chance at life, right? The chance at survival is really what's at stake.
Okay, so that sort of gets to the heart of what migration is. I'm just going to give one more statistic because you touched on that, and then we're going to go to questions, which is Oxfam just recently released a report, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, anticipating that by the end of the year, 12,000 people per day could die from hunger linked to COVID, potentially more than will die from the disease itself, which is probably gives us a reason why, migration will likely continue even as many supposedly or previously robust economies like that in the United States, like that of Spain, start to go into these forms of recession. So I think that Gregory has been collating questions, and he is going to open the floor or the screen to them now.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Kay. Terrific discussion. I will remind participants that to ask a question, please click on the hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom, at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, and we'll pick you chronologically. And you'll be muted until I call on you to speak. And please introduce yourself and ask a single brief question. Or you can write in questions through the chat function, which I will read. And we'll try to get to everybody, but apologies in advance if we can't. I would actually like to ask the first question, if I may, of both Malia and Amelia. Just very briefly, all of these issues and all these problems that you've been talking about for many of the world's population, people who don't generally think about migration, they feel that it doesn't concern them. They're just living their own lives. Can you speak briefly about how what's happening now is going to affect life for everybody in the next whatever few years, foreseeable future?
I feel like that's one of those hard questions to answer because it seems so obvious to me that, like, of course this matters, but I understand the sort of, like, not everyone is as deeply thinking about these issues as those of us in this panel are. I think I'm an anthropologist. When we look at the history of humanity, it is a history of migration. We as people are very, very good at figuring out how to go to a place where we can build a better life for ourselves, whatever that means in a broad sense. But it is something that is at the core of our species, quite literally, that we move and we adapt and we search a place where we can settle. So this period right now is not unlike the other periods of human history and not unlike what will happen in the future. As a planet, we are facing all kinds of existential issues that we are going to have to deal with one way or another. Climate change is going to further displace millions of people around the globe. There is no escaping that. It is already happening, and it is only going to get worse. And this pandemic is already showing the fragile infrastructure of a world health, a world kind of public health authority. The potential for future pandemics to happen, I think, is higher now than we would have thought it was a couple years ago. And all of these things are going to cause people to be displaced. So if you're in the global north and you are concerned about people coming to your country, figuring out ways to address the egregious imbalance of infrastructure and resources on the planet is essential, because people will keep fleeing to find safety somewhere. And so in terms of climate change and in terms of healthcare and in terms of being able to lead a full and safe life, this is going to keep happening whether or not anybody in the developed nations in the global north wants it to.
Thank you. Malia, do you want to jump in?
That was so articulate. I'm not sure what else, what I can add above that. One thing I will, yeah, it's, I mean, it's so hard, because this is something I ask myself a lot as somebody who writes about immigration, because I feel like there's such an empathy gap right now around this. And it's so hard for me to wrap my head around, because I don't know, maybe because I think that is such a universal story. And if you go back, I mean, for me, it's quite recent. And for my family, it's like, you know, my husband, my grandfather, who were both refugees, but like, we all have that linkage. And right now, with all of the changes that we're seeing with the globe, I mean, you're going to be seeing climate refugees. You already are seeing climate refugees within the US. And I think one thing that is useful to look at, useful to see, is when I look at like Spanish history specifically, there was this other like massive, like, I think, I can't remember the dates right now, but it was quite in recent history, from the late 90s to like 2015, that they had this huge like surge of immigrant population, and they handle it really well. They basically regularized most people. They give people for a kind of a pathway to participate in the economy, and that served them quite well. And I think that when you do find ways to give people the opportunity to work in their chosen fields, when you give them the opportunity, like, they really do rise to that occasion. And I think that they don't become this burden that people are, so like the specter of the burden that will take down the health. I think it's quite the opposite, actually. But I do think that there's a lot of fear right now. And I think that the only way that we're going to solve this is to be more collaborative.
And if I can just add one thing, sorry,
Yeah.
that I do think there's also a reality of who wants to move that is shifting a little bit. I think we can see Europe has not included the United States in the lists of countries that can visit, right? And I think it is a mistake for anyone to think that this kind of migration is only one direction, that there is only certain kinds of countries and certain kinds of people who are going to feel the need to move around the world. And I think the reality of that is going to hit people in the global north harder than many of us might be expecting.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I think first that most migration is actually within, international migration is within Africa, is south-south, from country to country within Africa. And that's not really any of our areas of expertise. Well, I had a little bit of it, but it's that's something that we haven't touched on that, is really going to be, she said, a large part of this as well, particularly as climate and COVID are actually just now, or the COVID situation is just now, not starting to explode, but really spreading there. So,
and I will say one other thing, that in Latin America in particular, COVID came with the people who had the privilege of travel, right? COVID came with people who had been in Europe, who had fancy State Department dinners when they came back to Latin America. Unlike many other pandemics that start kind of in the poorest communities and the most unequal communities, COVID started among the elites, and at least in Latin America. And I think the potential for future kinds of diseases and other issues can very well spread among elites.
So we have a question from Elizabeth Hawkins, our fellow in El Salvador, who is studying the push factors behind migration to the United States, or was doing this before the pandemic hit, and is now doing a terrific job researching and writing about wider issues, although of course all of these issues, politics and migration, it's all related. Elizabeth writes, Malia, do you know anything in particular about asylum seekers in Spain from the Northern Triangle? I know some Salvadorans who are looking to apply for asylum in Spain because it's considered more welcoming than the US, but the numbers I found have not borne that out. She writes, it's interesting to hear how Venezuelans are treated. I'd love to hear about Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans, if you know.
Yeah. So I'm not, honestly, I'm not as familiar with the cases from Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. I know that in general, right now, Spain's, like, the number of applications that they've accepted and that they've given the go-ahead for has been abysmal. This past year, I think it was 2000, like last year, it was dropped to 5%, which is excruciatingly low. Before, like in 2018, it was 20%, and the global average in Europe is like 35%. So right now, and honestly, I'm not 100% sure why it's so low. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that most applications are from Venezuela, and they're not giving asylum per se to Venezuelans. They have this kind of different accord, but they always go through the asylum system. So that could be kind of changing the statistics a little bit. But even with that, it's still quite low. And when I've talked to experts about this, I haven't really gotten a satisfactory response to what's really driving that. So I know that people from Latin America don't get deported in the same numbers as people from any part of Africa, which is another aspect of Spanish racism, basically, here, that you do see that people are able to stay. And there is something here in Spain where after 3 years of being undocumented, there is an opportunity to regularize. It's not easy, but it's possible. It's not like you get blocked out for 10 years like in the US. So in some ways it's friendlier, but in terms of getting into the asylum system, I don't think it's a lot easier. But even getting asylum in Spain doesn't give you a lot. You don't have the same support structure that you do in Northern Europe. You get a tiny bit of aid, you get work permits, but it's not enough to really to live on and to I mean, it's not as robust as it is in other countries in Europe.
So Elizabeth has another question for Amelia. She writes, I'd also like to know what kind of stigma deportees are facing in Honduras. Here in El Salvador, many are being rejected by their communities because they're perceived to be infected, even though they've been through quarantine.
Yeah, I think I can answer that and also answer Michelle's question maybe together, because I think they go hand in hand. So I haven't heard a lot of stigma specifically related to deportees in Honduras. Deportation doesn't have the same stigma in Honduras in general as it does in other countries, because it's just so common. But there is an increase. So the other question, Michelle's question, was about violence and extortion and how much that is still driving people to leave. And so that hasn't really stopped in Honduras. That hasn't abated. There's been some reports in some parts of the world, in Brazil and in Mexico for a little while, and El Salvador for a little while, but it seems to have gone away, that organized crime, violence, gang-related violence was down because they were also involved in enforcing curfews and things like that. That never really happened in Honduras. Those levels of violence and extortion have stayed pretty much consistent. But what has been noted is there has been a spate of violence against people who are suspected of having COVID-19. Now, those aren't people who've been deported, but there is a rising incidence of violence being used to do away with people who are suspected of possibly being contaminated.
So I have another question for the both of you, and that's, I don't know, it may be a silly one, but if you talk a little bit about how the pandemic is affecting your research. Obviously, you can't go out and talk to people. You can't travel. How do you feel that your knowledge of what's going on is being affected, and how, how are you changing your work? Where are you getting information from? Do you have lines of communication to people on the ground? How is this affecting your professional lives.
I guess I can start. So a lot of getting in touch, and basically my main way of getting in touch with people who are affected has been primarily first through NGOs and those sorts of groups who then get me in touch with them over WhatsApp mostly, which obviously, like, it's not ideal because they're picking who your source is, but then, you know, you can talk to that source and then ask for more contacts through them. So it's possible, but it's difficult. I mean, it's especially here in Spain, like, I don't have a car, so I would have taken a car to maybe go to visit some of these places, because journalists technically did even during the lockdown have the ability to move, but without having my own vehicle, that wasn't an option. So it's definitely been difficult to see what's happening where people are most affected. One thing I also want to say just about how my interest is changing as a result of this. I've been looking into issues around basically just supply chains and how migrants have been impacted, because oftentimes migrant workers are the people working like on at the very bottom of the supply chain, on the farms, on the in the factories and whatnot. One of the big issues that I'm seeing in that respect is that there's not a lot of monitoring anyway of these, and so there's a lot of violations. But I recently did a piece on Bangladesh factories, for example, and how, like, these big these big brands have canceled orders and how that's impacted workers. And there used to be a certain amount of leverage that unions could have because they were able to, you know, if they had violations in the factories, they could talk to the corporation. Now, no one's doing on-site visits. So basically, like, all of the monitors, so I think that what we're seeing right now, just talking about migration in general, is a huge amount of vulnerability to trafficking, a huge amount of vulnerability to forced labor. And it's a lot harder for all of the watchdogs. Like, I've been talking to people, like sources who are the watchdogs on these issues, and they don't have access to the people they're supposed to be protecting. They can't rescue them. And if they even know that there's a child who's vulnerable of sexual exploitation, who's being abused, and that's really troubling. And so in terms of how to get around that, I think we're all grappling with that at the moment. Like, I'm not really sure beyond, you know, use of social media, but then there are people who don't have access to those things. So those are some of the people who are the most vulnerable who you want to be able to talk to. And yeah, that's what I've observed is the issue with, I think, the vulnerability to forced labor is a really big issue right now.
So yeah, I think a lot of those things are, for all of us, any of us who do research, are grappling with this distance, right? Like, being unable to actually get close to the people that we usually talk to is a really hard thing to adapt to. Personally, I'm in the fortunate position of I finished, since I'm not a journalist, I don't have to be constantly investigating things. So I finished my fieldwork for my dissertation in Honduras at the end of 2019. And now I'm in the process of analyzing data that I collected over 2 years and writing my dissertation and associated articles. And so I don't feel the pressure to figure out, to do new investigations at this moment, which I'm quite grateful for. But I will say that because I also care, I do stay in touch with people in Honduras very regularly. And I was supposed to be in Honduras again in April. And obviously that couldn't happen. But one of the things that is happening in Honduras is that as part of its response to the pandemic, the government has used it as an excuse to shut down access to information, to go after the freedom of speech and the free press, and human rights defenders in general. There's been a number of people detained for violating quarantine, and a shockingly high percentage of them are journalists. And a couple of journalists were murdered last week in Honduras as well. So getting information from Honduras, although I'm in touch with people via WhatsApp mostly in a pretty constant way, getting any kind of systematic information, for example, what's happening in the prisons in Honduras is a black hole of information, and it is it's going to explode. It's a really, really scary situation. And the government has used the pandemic as an excuse to basically shut down all kinds of access to information and people reporting and telling the truth about what's happening there.
Well, we are right up against an hour, so that's all we have time for. Thank you so much to the panelists, Malia, Amelia, and Kay, for a terrific discussion. Thank you for to the audience for taking part. We'll have video on the website soon, and please, everybody, have a terrific weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.